So let's tell a story about the cafe scene in Marrickville. Many, many moons ago, 20 years ago, I used to live in Marrickville. And up until the 2000s, there were no what I would call real cafes in the suburb of Marrickville. But the demographics of Marrickville started to change over time. And so did the income levels and the tastes of the residents of the suburb. So by the early 2000s, an enterprising fellow discerned that there was untapped demand for good quality coffee in the suburb. So he set up a cafe in the main street. The demand was high, and the business made large profits. That is, total revenue exceeded total costs. Now, soon after this first cafe's spectacular success became common knowledge, another cafe soon set up shop around the corner. Then there was another one after that, and another one after that, and within the space of 2 years, Marrickville went from having 0 cafes to having 7 cafes. Customers were really spoilt for choice, and the prices were relatively low. But the entrepreneurs, each of them individually, were worried, because with each new cafe, their individual revenues were falling relative to their costs of production. A couple of cafes started hiring the occasional live musician, one added an ice cream bar, another started specialising in handmade chocolates. At this point, one more cafe entrepreneur boldly entered the now flooded cafe market. He was going to face an uphill battle, but he was located near the train station. So he hoped that the daytime foot traffic of people commuting to and from work would ensure that he would have sufficient demand to survive. He also added live music and poetry readings at night to his cafe scene. Alas, demand and thus his revenue never rose above his costs of production, and within a year his business had died. That's the story that I want to tell about the Marrickville coffee scene in the early 2000s. Now let's get on to the questions. There's the first cafe in Marrickville. It was called Cellini's. And here are the others that emerged. Well, a few of them anyway. So let's try and represent this first cafe with the theoretical tools that we've been developing so far, and we're going to do it in graphical form, of course. So let's start off with a marginal cost curve. We're in the short run. Got a marginal cost curve. It's a tick shape, and we'll put in the average total cost curve, noting the average total cost curve is cutting the marginal cost curve at its lowest point. And then we need to draw in an average revenue curve or a demand curve for this firm's product. Now we want to make sure that this firm is making a profit. That's what we want to represent. So we have to ensure that the average revenue curve is above the average total cost curve for at least a portion of it. So let's draw it here. Now we know we've got to also draw in a marginal revenue curve. The marginal revenue curve will have double the slope of the average revenue curve. So we'll put that in there. Alright, so now we need to make some idealizing assumptions. We're going to assume the cafe owner knows about all of these curves, and that the cafe owner is attempting to maximize their profit in a mathematically precise way. So they're going to produce at the point where the marginal revenue equals the marginal cost. That will be the optimal output here. So then we can establish the price that they're going to charge and what the average cost of each coffee is going to be. There's our average cost given by the average cost curve at the optimal output, and there's the price that consumers are willing to pay for that optimal output. We can see there that there's a difference between the price per unit the cafe obtains and the cost per unit of each coffee. So price per unit, or average revenue, minus average cost gives you average profit, multiplied by the quantity produced gives you the total profit, this area here. So this is our graphical representation based on some idealizing assumptions about that first cafe in Marrickville when it has no competitors. So here we've got our cafe with no competitors, but then because other budding entrepreneurs gain knowledge that there's money to be made in their coffee beans, new cafes start to enter the market. Now, from the perspective of our original firm, this will be reflected in the fact that the firm's demand curve will shift downwards because it's lost some customers, but it will also become slightly flatter because as new firms enter the market, these new firms are producing substitutes for this firm's product. And when there are more substitutes available to customers, the demand for a product becomes more price elastic. And graphically, we can reflect that by making the demand curve slightly flatter. So this will happen. We recalculate the profits, optimal output where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. Voila, we've got the profit. The firm's still making profit. The price is still greater than the average cost, but it's clearly less profit than before because it's lost some customers. New firms enter the market, demand falls and becomes flatter again until we end up in this situation where at the optimal output the firm is just breaking even. That is, the price per unit just equals the cost per unit. And it's arguable this is exactly what happened in the cafe market in Marrickville. As new firms entered the market, the demand for the product for the coffee had to be shared around, and so all of the entrepreneurs, including the original cafe, ended up in a situation where they were just breaking even. Well, how were the cafes trying to compete with each other? You'll remember that I mentioned that as new cafes entered the market, all sorts of different side products or characteristics of each cafe started to emerge. So a couple of them had live music, and then there was one selling specialty chocolates, and the one selling ice cream, and so on. What they're doing here is that they're trying to further differentiate their products. They're trying to produce products, or produce what we might call a composite product. That is, a product which has multiple facets to it. Really, when you go to a cafe, you're not just buying coffee, you're buying an experience of drinking coffee at a cafe. So each firm is trying to develop its own cafe experience. It's differentiating its overall product in the attempt to try and capture a niche within the suburb of a particular group of customers who particularly like this type of cafe experience, whatever it happens to be, more than any other cafe in the suburb. Why did the last cafe die? Well, the last cafe died not just because it wasn't able to generate sufficient demand. That's the obvious answer. The market in Marrickville was essentially flooded by the time we got to 7 cafes. It was a saturated market. Each of the firms was essentially breaking even. Doesn't mean they weren't making normal profit, of course. They're making normal profit. The entrepreneurs are taking home their own compensation, so they're not starving to death. But really, adding another cafe was going to mean that if it got an equal share of the customers, none of the cafes would be making enough money to survive. However, as it turns out, this firm's attempt to differentiate its product was not successful. It wasn't as attractive as the pre-existing firms. This might be because the path that they went down of product differentiation was just crappy. So they had poetry reading nights, and that was awful because, amateur poets are just as a general rule pretty terrible. So it never really got off the ground. Also, the idea that you would get foot traffic from the train station seems like a good idea, but in retrospect, didn't really work very well. People who would be going to work don't buy a coffee to take onto the train with them because they end up spilling it somewhere. What about the foot traffic coming home off the train in the afternoons? Well, as it turns out, as you know from hanging around Parramatta campus, at about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, most of the cafes close down, even though people are streaming out of the office spaces at about 5 o'clock. Why aren't they staying open? Well, it's because when people are going home, they don't want to drink coffee on the way home because for many people that just keeps them up all night. So being too close to the train station meant that they weren't getting anyone buying coffee to get on the train, and they certainly weren't getting anyone buying coffee as they came off the train to go home. So, in retrospect, a bad strategy. Also, another issue with cafes is that they develop customer loyalty. Drinking coffee is a habitual activity, and people tend to, once they start going to a cafe and they've gone to a cafe for long enough, they'll just keep going to that cafe. And it's often very hard for a new cafe coming into the market to break those habits, to break that customer loyalty. And they just weren't able to do it. And that's why they died. The behaviour of the cafes by opening so early in the morning and yet not making a profit that early in the morning is not necessarily a signal of irrational behaviour. It may in fact be perfectly rational behaviour, and I'll illustrate how that could be. Let's say the cafe decides to open at 7 o'clock in the morning, 7 to 8 in the morning. That means it's got to hire workers, and let's say the total variable cost is $200 for those few hours. These are funny numbers, obviously. We're not trying to be accurate in terms of the accounting here. We're illustrating the point. So, and then we've got the fixed or capital costs of $200. So these fixed costs, they're fixed. They're always going to have to be paid no matter what. So we add up the total fixed cost and the total variable cost to get the overall total cost of being open for that early period in the morning. Now, by being open, they'll get customers. And let's say they get $300 worth of revenue by being open at 7 a.m. We can see there by being open from 7 to 8, they make a loss of $100. However, from the perspective of the entrepreneur, they have to think of the alternative, and the alternative is not being open. Now, if you're not staying open, obviously you don't have any variable costs because you're not hiring workers if you're not open, but you also don't have any revenue. Nonetheless, there's still the fixed costs. The fixed costs are always there, they're fixed. So the entrepreneur is still paying rent, whether they're open or not. They're still paying interest on their loans, whether they're open or not. But there's no variable costs and there's no revenue. What's the loss now by not being open? Well, it's $200. Which would you prefer? Would you prefer to be closed and making a loss of $200? Or would you prefer to be open and at least making enough revenue to cover some of those fixed costs in addition to the variable costs? Staying open, you make a loss, but you make a smaller loss. So it's rational to be open at that hour of the morning, and that's the answer to that.